Hi, everyone. I'm coming to you at about 4:55 my time. I live streamed chapter 1 on Mountains of Spices earlier today, but the camera was all fuzzy, and so was the audio. And sometimes you never know. Here at my house, sometimes I get a lot of skips, and sometimes it's just perfect. So I'm going to give it another try and read it again, and hope that you all will be able to come on and read it, come on and watch it at some point. So I'm going to read the scripture for today in chapter 1 is Psalm 118:24. This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. And of course, that's a scripture that we all probably have memorized, but I was thinking the beauty of the day isn't that it's new so much, but that we're being made new in it. So it's both good. In the glory of the day, not that it marks a change, but that we're being changed in it. And that's the beauty of the Lord, is He gives us a new day each day, and He gives us a new life every single day. And He changes us in that wonderful day He creates. So chapter 1 in Mountains of Spices, again, Mountains of Spices is the sequel to Hind's Feet on High Places, which I just loved. And I read Mountains of Spices back in 1992, and I don't remember much of it, so it'll all be a surprise to me. But since it is a sequel, and it seemed like Hind's Feet left us at the point where Much Afraid did get her new name and her new feet and was healed in other ways, her heart, her fearful heart, and her crooked mouth. But Mountains of Spices will be when she goes down into the valley where she used to live, and where all her relatives who really did hate her were, and they're still living there. And so she's going down just out of love and joy. And we'll see what she comes across when she goes down to the valley. And the valley, of course, was named the Valley of Humiliation. So that may give us a clue. So chapter 1 is Mrs. Dismal Forebodings. And of course, that's a silly name, but the names are meant to describe. We can have attitudes that might be a little small thing. Let's say, oh, we might be a little dismal today, or we might be all thinking, oh, it's not so nice out today. Maybe I'll stay in. Whatever it is, forebodings. If we keep with those attitudes and keep bringing them forth day after day after day, they can become real strongholds. They can become very strong habits of wrong ways of thinking. And this Mrs. Dismal Forebodings is the aunt of Grace and Glory. And she doesn't want to even accept Grace and Glory's new name. Give you a little secret. Looking forward on it. But the thing is, nobody wants to be that way. Even in this book, we can see that this person doesn't want to be dismal. We can see through all of it. So try to look through these names and their attitudes and see really what were they when God created them, when He knit them together in their mother's wombs, and when they were little. What kind of person were they then? Just imagine. And then imagine things could have happened in their lives that created these attitudes because they couldn't overcome them. They couldn't forgive, couldn't move past, whatever. So it says, it was a perfect spring morning down in the Valley of Humiliation, and everything seemed to be rejoicing in the warm sunshine and the soft, fragrant air. The pastures were robed in fairest green. The fruit trees were wearing festal apparel of white and pink blossoms. In the breeze, the wildflowers were dancing gaily, while the asphodels, with the sun shining through their transparent white blooms, stood rank on the steep slopes above the blue lake like an army of wax torches. In the pastures through which the river wound, the lambs frisked about their mothers, and the kids played catch me if you can among the rocks. Birds of every size and description worked ardently at the business of nest building, and the art echoed with the sound of innumerable calls and trills, while bees and crickets kept up a constant undertone of humming. Altogether, it was a perfect day down there in the valley, with everything that had breath and moved out in the open was welcoming spring. In the shadow of some old, dark, twisted trees, however, standing back from the main road, which ran through the village of Much Trembling. See, that's the name of the village she lived in. In the Valley of Humiliation, the village was called Much Trembling, and her family was the Fearing family. Much Trembling was a garden overgrown with weeds and sickly-looking cabbage plants. Moping in the middle of the garden was a most dilapidated cottage, the windows and doors of which were all tightly shut. Up from the chimney of this cottage rose a thin, furtive-looking spiral of smoke, which crept up into the air as unostentatiously as possible, as though ashamed to show itself on such a perfect day as this. Inside the cottage, cowering over the smoky little fire, sat Mrs. Dismal Forebodings, wearing a dreary-hued dress and wrapped in a drearier gray shawl, while her face wore an expression of deepest misery and gloom. Let's see what I have here. So what do you see in those cottage surroundings and description of Mrs. Dismal Forebodings? And how do you think those things contribute to her state of mind? She lived in the shadows and back in the thick trees in a dilapidated, oh my goodness, it's raining. First big rain I've seen all summer. Can you hear it? Wow. I'm not going to let it make me dreary, though. I had plans of being in the garden today. So Mrs. Dismal, she lived back in the shadows, dilapidated garden, dilapidated cottage that shows no care being taken of it. Possibly she didn't have any help. Maybe she couldn't do that herself. But, and she was wearing an old gray dress and a gray shawl. Even in her clothing, it was describing her thought patterns. And her face was gloomy. She sat in front of this fire on a warm spring day. Yeah. So she's probably, I would say, a broken-hearted widow that has not let the past go. And she's reliving and reliving. And if we think these patterns of thoughts, these dismal thoughts, over and over and over, they do become strongholds. They become very solid attitudes. And then they can manifest in how we act and look. And also it will cause people to go away from us. So there came a brisk rap at the door. And almost before Mrs. Dismal's hesitating "come in" could be heard, in marched her neighbor, Mrs. Valiant. The contrast between the two women was as great as possible, and everyone in Much Trembling wondered at the friendship. If such a one-sided affair could be so named, which existed between them. But it dated back to their school days, and Mrs. Valiant seemed to have a queer notion, as the neighbors called it, of not allowing the friendship to drop. Mrs. Valiant marched into the room, stopped short, and uttered what sounded exactly like a little snort. "Good gracious, Dismal," she exclaimed. "What are you doing in here with all the windows shut on such a perfect day as this? That horrid little smoky stove is enough to suffocate you." "Please shut the door behind you at once, Valiant," said Mrs. Dismal fretfully. "The draft is simply cruel." See, she's putting cruel to describe the draft. The draft has no cruelty. It's just a draft. And it really is no draft anyway, because there's no breeze and it's a warm day. So this is all how she was perceiving things. "The draft is simply cruel, and this dreadful east wind always increases my rheumatism unendurably." "East wind," said Mrs. Valiant with another snort. "My dear Dismal, the air is as balmy as on a midsummer day, and what little breeze there is coming directly from the south." "My weathercock never lies," replied Mrs. Dismal firmly. "And when I looked at it this morning, the wind was in the east. Besides, I feel it all over me in every bone and joint in my body, and don't need even the confirmation of the weathercock." "At least," urged Mrs. Valiant, "let me open the south window, and do, my dear Dismal, allow yourself to be persuaded to lay aside that dreadful shawl and to put on something cooler and prettier, and come out with me for a little while. For," added she in a mysterious tone, "the most delightful and unexpected thing has happened, and I have come along on purpose to take you to my cottage so that you can share in the pleasure." Mrs. Dismal, however, refused to be either curious or interested. Instead, she poked the fire, causing a thick spiral of choking smoke to billow out into the room, and said with a shiver, "Even if it were the warmest of days, I would not venture out of the cottage today, for my almanac tells me that it is a black day, a day of gloom and darkness and danger, and harm would certainly befall me if I ventured outside. I have great faith in my almanac and never disregard its warnings." See, she's reading this superstition and she's thinking, "Oh, even if I was to go out, I would fall. Something bad would happen." It's those forebodings, thinking, if I do this, what will happen? "What almanac is that?" cried Mrs. Valiant, walking up to the wall on which was pinned a large and hideous monstrosity. "Why, Dismal, don't tell me you've gone in for astrology. This is printed by a well-known firm of swindling frauds who live by exploiting the fears of other people." It's pure nonsense. Mrs. Dismal looked much affronted and answered tartly, "I have never known my valuable almanac to be mistaken. When it says that woe and calamity are an approaching, and a calamity of some sort always does follow, and I shall not be foolish enough to disregard its warnings today, but shall remain indoors." See, even scientists say that what we focus on can eventually be attracted into our atmosphere. It's called the law of the observer effect. And I think spiritually speaking also, we think these things and, think just like Job, it says the things he feared came to him eventually. So, yeah. So our thoughts along with our words are very powerful. And we can choose either life and death, because that's in the power of the tongue, and even before the tongue, in the head and in the heart. So Mrs. Valiant says, I wish you would let me tear the horrid thing off the wall and throw it in the fire. And let me put up one of the red letter calendars which I use myself. For today mine says, this is the day which the Lord has made, and we will be glad and rejoice in it. Nothing will induce me to discard my valuable almanac, said poor Mrs. Dismal. Neither shall I venture to set foot outside the cottage today. As sure as my name is Dismal Forebodings, calamity is near. See, she's prophesying it ahead of her. If I had a name like that, cried Mrs. Valiant, suddenly losing all her patience, I would certainly get rid of it and change it to a better one. Mrs. Dismal was deeply offended. But whenever her warm-hearted, if rather quick-tempered neighbor became impatient, she always reacted with martyr-like resignation. So now she said in a tone of patient reproach, It is a very ancient and honorable name, Valiant, and it has been credibly demonstrated to date back to before the flood. There have been dismal forebodings for longer than can be reckoned. Mrs. Valiant laughed heartily at her friend's absurdity, though this was one of the times when she felt she would dearly like to shake a little sense into the poor, silly creature before her. But she had an inner reason, known only to herself and the chief shepherd, for bearing along with her unhappy neighbor and learning to accept her lovingly just as she was. So now she answered cheerfully, but tactlessly, well, the antediluvian dismal forebodings must have become extinct anyhow, for there were none of them in the ark. I wonder who was foolish enough to found the family name again. Mrs. Dismal was now too offended to reply. She drew her shawl closer around her shoulders and shivered and appeared to be unconscious that there was anyone beside herself in the cottage. She's just shutting her out completely and being in and comfortable with her old way of thinking. Mrs. Valiant, her conscience smote her. And it was really dreadful the way she let her tongue run away with her when she had come on purpose to try to help her friend. She hurried to apologize, saying penitently, Forgive me, Dismal dear. I know I ought not to have said that, but oh, how I wish you would let me help you out of this unhappy condition into which you have fallen, and persuade you to put off dreariness and to put on the garment of praise. See, remember that song, you put on a garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness. Yes. And once you have that garment of praise on, that's that first step, right? Change your clothing. But of course, we're talking about change your attitude into praise instead of, all the things that she was thinking. So the contrast between Mrs. Dismal and Mrs. Valiant is just very clear. And why do you think Mrs. Valiant keeps that friendship? We got a little bit of a secret on it. Is that the chief shepherd and she had a reason for her continuing that friendship and patiently going back and back and back to Mrs. Foreboding's home. Do you have such friendships like that, or have you in the past? They're pretty one-sided, and it's Mrs. Foreboding's, her whole perception of life and of people are clouded by probably her bitterness, her unforgiveness, her offense, I would say. And she probably did have some very horrible things happen to her. Well, that's possible. but she still is, it's not even a life. It's like she's living, but she's not. She's just staying in that one place all the time. Even on a warm, sunny day, see, her perception is that, oh, it's cold and the wind is cold and it's going to hurt me. And that just was not true. But Mrs. Valiant, she was cheerful, right? And active and full of faith. And if the weather was balmy and beautiful, Mrs. Dismal was seeing it as cruel. See, she was putting a human attribute to the weather, to the wind, saying it was cruel. And when she saw the weather, she saw it was, she thought it was causing her pains, and that was a lie. The atmosphere wasn't causing her pains. So how would you handle a person so negative? She doesn't want to really be alone, even though she says she does. I don't think she really wants to be alone. And so I'm glad that this Mrs. Valiant keeps on pursuing the friendship. Someone like her would probably cry after her friend left, even though she was, just not open to her and rude to her, didn't want her to come and wanted her to leave. I think Mrs. Dismal probably cried after Mrs. Valiant left. Probably her only friend in the world, right? Yeah. But the shepherd wanted Mrs. Valiant to accept Mrs. Foreboding as she was, and to keep that relationship going. And to keep trying to coax her out of that unhappy condition, that jail cell that she had put herself in by the spirit of dreariness. Yeah. Mrs. Dismal burst into tears. How can you talk like that, Valiant? You're absolutely heartless. I'm sure I was always cheerful and contented enough before. But now that all this cruel trouble has come upon me, what can you expect? A desolate widow woman all these years, working myself to death to provide for my 3 unfortunate children. This was a bit of an invention, as Mrs. Dismal's husband left her a small but adequate annuity. And to bring them up respectably and prepare them for happier homes of their own than ever fell to my lot. See, she's thinking everything is like by chance, falling to her lot. And now what has happened, Valiant, perfectly well, yet you are heartless enough to stand there rebuking me for being miserable. My daughter Gloomy, deserted by her graceless husband, her position lost, put to shame before all her relatives, and obliged to come creeping home to her widowed mother, she, the daughter-in-law of Lord Fearing himself, with no one prepared to lift a finger to help her get her rights. And then, poor Spiteful, to find herself married to a drunkard who beats and abuses her shamefully, forced to live in a miserable little attic, a poor and despised relative in the house of her cousins. And Craven, here she sobbed convulsively, my darling Craven, my only son, wrongfully condemned on a trumped-up charge of assault and disorderly behavior, actually put in prison. Well, we know what Craven Fear was like from reading Hind's Feet, right? He was just a big bully, and they wanted her to marry him. And that's the big reason why she escaped that valley. And you, Valiant, who did at least once have a strong husband to support you, and still have children who apparently never cause you the least sorrow, there you stand upbraiding me and actually suggesting that I ought to put on the garment of praise, whatever sort of fantastic apparel that may be. It would obviously be utterly indecent clothing for a broken-hearted widow whose children are enduring a martyrdom of injustice and suffering. Wow. So, looking at Mrs. Dismal's list of calamities, what could you tell her that might help? Probably trauma, has affected her, and she's hung on to it, like I was saying, not letting it go. So now she's jealous, right? And she has excess sorrow. Sorrow comes, but joy comes in the morning. And she had troubles. She doesn't meet them with courage and grace, but she buckles into them. But those troubles, remember, grace and glory came up against a lot of troubles on the journey up to the high places. But she allowed grace to transform her through those troubles into something lovely. But the main thing I would say, like we just read, the shepherd wanted Mrs. Valiant to continue to love her and accept her as she was. Of course, not wanting her to stay that way, but just loving her and helping her find strength. How would you describe Mrs. Valiant's response to Mrs. Foreboding? Well, she is about as different as someone could be. And she is an eternal optimist, I would say. And it sounds to me like she's probably been with the shepherd herself. So Mrs. Valiant went up to the weeping woman and put her arms comfortingly around the shaking shoulders, saying very gently, "You misunderstand me, Dismal. I do know all about your sorrows and troubles, and it would make me so happy to be able to comfort you a little bit and to help you find strength and courage to meet them and grace to transform them into something lovely. That is really why I'm here this morning. Let me tell you the happy news, dear Dismal, and persuade you to go with me to my cottage. For do you know what has happened? No, I'm sure you will never be able to guess. Something to gladden even your sad heart." She paused, hopefully looking for a gleam of interest or curiosity in the miserable face before her. But Mrs. Dismal Forebodings continued to sob and to rock herself backwards and forwards, utterly indifferent to anything else in the whole wide world except her own misfortunes. Now, these misfortunes that she had, they were years ago probably, but she's still acting like she's still letting them affect her as if it was yesterday. So after waiting a moment, Mrs. Valiant went on in a voice full of cheerfulness and pleasure. "Well, you'll never guess, so I will tell you. You remember that when your crippled niece, much afraid, left the valley, people said that the shepherd had taken her to the high places. Well, it was true, perfectly true. And do you know what has happened, Dismal? She has just returned to the valley on a visit." Wow. And she isn't a cripple longer. Her lame feet are completely, and so is her twisted mouth. She is so strong and straight, you would hardly know her. Besides that, she's got a new name. She's much afraid no longer, but is Grace and Glory. Just fancy that. What a beautiful name to receive. She has also brought her two friends with her, lovely women named Peace and Joy, and they tell us that Grace and Glory lives now in the kingdom of love and is actually a member of the royal household, and everywhere the king goes, she goes too. Just imagine it, Dismal. It's like the most wonderful fairy tale that you ever heard, only far lovelier because it's absolutely true. And it has all happened because she went with the shepherd to the high places. If Mrs. Valiant had wanted to gain the attention of her miserable friend, she had certainly succeeded. Mrs. Dismal Forebodings sat staring at her in what appeared to be stunned silence, apparently unable to say a word. So Mrs. Valiant went on happily. Now here she is back in the valley, as I said before, with her two friends. They are over in the cottage with my daughter, Mercy, and we are arranging a little party of welcome. Just a few of her old friends and neighbors, and you, her aunt, really must be there too. Come, dear Dismal, just for a little while. Dry your tears, for you cannot in any way help your dear ones by sitting here weeping your eyes out in this dreary room. Put on your best dress and come with me, and have a share in the rejoicing over the good things, the wonderful things, which have befallen poor miserable little Much Afraid. Mrs. Dismal Forebodings said not a word, for in truth she was almost stunned by the news, the dreadful news. Nothing, she felt, could be more untimely, more horrible, more humiliating than the return of the wretched cripple they had all despised, and whose departure they had tried to thwart. Here she was, it seemed, healed, surrounded with friends, advanced to glory and honor, a member of the king's household, now returning almost as a queen to the valley where she had been a miserable, despised nobody. Moreover, returning just in time to find her closest relatives in the most humiliating circumstance possible. Her cousin Gloomy, who had married so well, now deserted by her husband, a destitute beggar in her mother's cottage, spiteful, married to a drunkard who had nearly killed her, living a life of misery in a tiny attic, and worst of all, her cousin Craven Fear, whom she had so insultingly refused to marry, now actually in prison. Could the return have been more untimely? Could indeed anything which she, Dismal Forebodings, might have imagined be a greater calamity? How true my almanac is, said Mrs. Dismal to herself with a sinking of heart which even she had seldom before experienced. A day of calamity indeed. No severer blow could have befallen me. She said not a word, however. With an immense effort, she bit back the bitter lamentations which almost escaped her lips, for she suddenly remembered that an aunt would scarcely be expected to bewail the fact that a crippled niece had now returned to her old home, completely cured and holding a position in the king's household. If it had been any of our own relatives telling me the news, thought Dismal bitterly, they would have understood my feelings perfectly, and we would have lamented together. But Mrs. Valiant is quite different. Certainly, she would never understand. So she sat in frozen silence. Wow. So Mrs. Valiant wanted her to enjoy happy fellowship with her old friends and with her relatives. But instead, she's brooding about it. And she just can't come out of that. Come, Dismal, said Mrs. Valiant persuasively, after waiting in vain for some expression of pleasure or interest from her neighbor. Do come along with me to the cottage and see for yourself the delightful truth of what I've told you. Come and welcome Grace and Glory and enjoy the happy fellowship with other friends in my house, and forget for a little while your own grief in rejoicing with another. So that's how she responded to Mrs. Dismal. That's a good way to respond. At that, Mrs. Dismal at last found words. "Thank you, Valiant," said she, "but nothing will persuade me to leave the cottage today or to do anything so heartless as to seek personal enjoyment at a party while my daughters eat the bread of affliction and my son languishes in prison. As for Much Afraid," she continued, unable to conceal her bitterness any longer. She certainly was not going to call that girl by any new name that the king might have chosen to bestow upon her. As for Much Afraid, a more undutiful and ungrateful niece cannot exist anywhere. If she chooses to return now to gloat over the misfortunes which have overtaken her relatives, it is only another example of her callous nature, and I, for one, shall certainly not present her with an opportunity to do so. Pray return at once to your party, Valiant, and leave me to the solace of solitude in my misery. Seems very silly, but when you break everything down, a lot of people, maybe even some of us, had issues like this. Mrs. Valiant regretfully realized that she could do no good by staying longer, that any further importunity would only increase her neighbor's resistance and resentment. So she sorrowfully took her departure, having failed in a mission which in truth she had feared would prove unsuccessful. Left alone in the cottage, Mrs. Dismal Forebodings brooded on the disastrous news, and the more she brooded, the worse it seemed. What a cruel blow dealt by fate to permit that girl to return just now, who, if she had married Craven, as she ought to have done, would now be as disgraced and humiliated and wretched as her mother-in-law, and a convenient scapegoat on whom the family could have heaped their reproaches. You see, that's the truth. That's the truth. They hated her. But now, instead of that, here she was, gloriously free, richly provided for, and with an honorable new name. "It's scandalous," sobbed Mrs. Dismal. "The injustice of life, the hammer blows of fate, a calamity of calamities." See, she views life itself as full of calamity. Yeah. My goodness. So her reaction to the news about Much Afraid obviously was really, really awful. So what do you think about that? Is there anything, what can you think that might help her? Well, you wouldn't say, maybe you have to be led by the Lord, but you don't want to necessarily say, "Oh, you're jealous, you're bitter, you're, unforgiveness, you have offense." You can find a way to get into her heart like the Lord does. But he does it without reproach. See, he's already forgiven everything we ever did. He doesn't remember any of it. So he comes to heal us without any reproach. And so the more we can be like that, be like him, the better. And we can't do it on our own, obviously. So she sat there brooding bitterly for perhaps half an hour when she heard a light tap on the door of the cottage. And with a sickening sense of foreboding, she called out sourly, "Who's there?" "It is I, your niece, dear aunt. May I come in?" And with that, the door opened, and Grace and Glory stepped into the cheerless room. In spite of herself, Mrs. Dismal Forebodings looked with eager curiosity at the girl who had once been much afraid. She saw it was quite true what Mrs. Valiant had told her. There was a great difference in her. She was so straight and walked with such ease and poise that it gave one the impression that she was much taller than before. And now that the unsightly, deformed mouth was healed, she could look unshrinkingly and without self-consciousness into the face of others. She was very unlike the creature of former days. Yet in another way, thought Mrs. Dismal Forebodings, she is not at all out of the ordinary. Among a crowd, there would be nothing to single her out, except perhaps the expression of quiet, steady happiness on her face and the light in her eyes. Grace and Glory hesitated a moment at the door, and then, as her aunt offered not a single word of greeting, she walked quietly toward the gray, bent figure crouched in the rocking chair beside the stove, and stooping down, gently kissed her aunt's cheek. Mrs. Dismal Forebodings recoiled, almost as if a reptile had approached her, and putting out her hands, pushed her niece away. "There's no need for insincere tokens of affection, much afraid," she said coldly. "I can dispense with a kiss from you." Her niece looked at her compassionately, but only said gently, "I can understand just how you feel, dear aunt. I know that I was always sadly lacking in love and in attention to your wishes, but I hear that you have experienced much sorrow since we last saw one another, and my heart aches for you. I long to be able to help you in some way, or at least to share your sorrow." She paused a moment and then added shyly, "I have been changed, you know, since I went away and have learned to love. I have a new name now, and I hope a new nature." "So I heard from Mrs. Valiant," said her aunt icily, "but I certainly will not call you by anything but your real name. I can assure you, to make me forget what you were before, you will always be much afraid to me." "Well, I can understand that too," said Grace and Glory, "and you may call me by the old name if you so please. But," she added smilingly, "Grace is a shorter and easier name to say, and exactly describes the means by which all the happiness and peace and healing have come to me. Dear Aunt Dismal, if only I could persuade you, in your sorrow and grief and pain, to turn to the one who so graciously and wonderfully helped me." A flush of angry color appeared in her aunt's cheeks. "Do I understand you to refer to—" she stumbled over the hated name, "to the shepherd much afraid?" "Yes," answered her niece earnestly. "I beg, no, rather I command that you will not ever mention that name to me again," said Miss Dismal Forebodings in a voice shaking with angry excitement. "You know well enough what all of us thought about your disgraceful behavior, forsaking all your relatives in the most heartless manner. But do you know what happened afterwards? Do you know that it was that shepherd of yours who trumped up the false charges against my unhappy son, Craven, which resulted in his being put in prison? My only son, treated as a common felon and sentenced to a 6-month term of imprisonment." Grace and Glory, who had come to the cottage with her heart overflowing with love and compassionate longing to help her aunt escape from the misery which she herself had known in the past, could think of nothing to say. She had her own personal memories of Craven Fear's bullyings, and could well understand how much some hapless victim must have rejoiced to be delivered by the shepherd out of his clutches, and also that a term in prison might well prove to be a salutary though bitter lesson to him. but she didn't feel that it was the moment to suggest all this to his mother. So she really did not know what to say. It was the dreadful contrast to everything which she had hoped and expected, thought Grace and Glory to herself, which made it so unspeakably difficult. Up there on the high places in the kingdom of love, where every thought was love, and her companion's joy and peace were never absent, how different things had looked. She remembered how, but a short time before, she had been sitting beside the king in the royal gardens, and they had looked down into this valley, and her heart had ached and throbbed with compassion and with a longing to be able to help her relatives. Nothing had seemed too difficult for love to undertake, if only they could be rescued and delivered from the tormenting things by which they were enslaved. But now, down here, face to face with reality, how different, how almost impossibly different it seemed. Here was her aunt absolutely shut up within her own miserable self. That's the prison, isn't it? She could think of nothing else, be interested in nothing else, for all her thoughts were chained to the one wretched center. She was as outside the realm of love as though she lived in a world of utter darkness, where love simply did not exist. How, oh how, thought Grace and Glory desperately, could one get into her dungeon? And how could one strike off the chains which the prisoner seemed actually to cherish and to be unwilling to be rescued from? How could one even speak to her of the only deliverer when she believed that he was the cause of all her unhappiness? Yes, indeed, it was one thing up there in the glory and light of the kingdom of love to feel a passionate longing to help and save, but when one got right down into the midst of the actual reality, how was it to be done? How could one reach hearts immured in impregnable prisons? And how awaken even the beginning of a desire for deliverance? Grace and Glory remembered the whole conversation up there on the high places and how they had all agreed that this was the very likeliest time of all for them to be able to help Mrs. Dismal Forebodings and her family, because the calamities which had overtaken them would surely make them begin to feel their need of the shepherd's help. Many times that is what causes us to turn to the Lord, is when our lives get very hard, when we come to the end of our rope. Heaven forbid that, we don't want that to always happen, but sometimes that is what happens. But now it's all so different, she thought. She remembered the voice of the king saying, "I need someone to speak for me, for they will not come to me themselves." And her glad, exultant cry that she would be his mouthpiece. She remembered the tone in which he had said, "Do you think they will listen to you, Grace and Glory?" What had she answered? "You shall tell me what to say, and I will say it for you." Yes, thought Grace and Glory suddenly, that is the answer. He must tell me what to say. He must teach me. I can do nothing now, but I will go to him and will tell him all about it. And I will ask him to teach me what approach I am to make and how to win right through into my aunt's prison house. However, she made one last attempt to break down the antagonism against herself. "Dearest aunt," she said, "I do hope you will sometimes let me come to see you to do what I can to help. And perhaps next time you will let me tell you how I was delivered from all my fears and sorrows." Thank you, much afraid, said her aunt icily, "but I'm not interested. I know already just what you'll say, and it's the last thing I'm interested to hear." Grace and Glory, feeling exactly as though she were holding a tiny pebble in her hand with which to try to batter down an impregnable stronghold, which is true, rose to her feet and prepared to take her departure. She put her arms around her aunt and kissed the coldly unresponsive cheek, saying softly, "Only let me love you, Aunt Dismal. Let me try to atone in some way for all my lovelessness in the past. Do let me come to see you and my cousin Gloomy and help in any way that I can." You see, Much Afraid, who is now Grace and Glory, she sees the lovelessness she had in the past, if anyone else did. But once you do see how loveless we were, yeah. But the only answer she received was, "You have chosen and gone your own way, Much Afraid, and it's not my way. And I do not hesitate to tell you that even though misfortune has overtaken me, while good fortune has smiled upon you." Again, fortune, she's talking about good fortune again, the fate. "While good fortune has smiled upon you, I do not at all desire to be pitied and patronized by you. Smitten I may be, and left desolate and friendless." And she's not friendless. Mrs. Valiant was just there trying to get her to come out. And then there's Much Afraid. That's two right there. Desolate and friendless, but patronized I will not be. You need not trouble yourself to visit here again. Grace and Glory left the cottage and walked sadly away, wondering if anything could have been more unlike her radiant, loving dreams of helping her relatives than the actual reality. For a few moments, she felt almost overwhelmed. When, however, she reached the cottage where she and Mercy had lived together and found her friend and Mrs. Valiant bustling around, full of cheerful preparations for the party to which the chief shepherd himself had been invited, and when she saw Joy and Peace, whom she had left at the cottage, telling herself that if she were accompanied by her two handmaidens when she visited her miserable aunt, that she might appear to be showing off. When she met their lovely greeting, she did feel a balm applied to her heart. And she said to herself, "Next time I go to visit Aunt Dismal, I shall take Joy and Peace with me." So that's a play on words, of course, because their names are Joy and Peace, but that's going to help her a lot to take joy and peace with her, right? Shalom and peace. There was just time before the guests arrived for bustling Mrs. Valiant to take her aside for a moment and whisper, "Well, my dear, how did you get on? And what sort of reception did you receive from that poor creature Dismal?" "She told me never to visit her again," answered Grace and Glory sorrowfully, "and I'm afraid she really meant it." "You would never believe how many times she has said that exact same thing to me," replied Mrs. Valiant cheerfully. "But she would be quick enough to object if I took her at her word. See, like I said, she really doesn't want to be alone." And Mrs. Valiant can see that Dismal really does want her for a friend. The only friend she has, right? Yeah. So what did Grace and Glory do when she saw her aunt who didn't want to receive her? Are there any people that you can remember where it was difficult when they responded this way to you? Has that ever happened? Well, she kept loving her, right? She kissed her again before she left and repented of her own lovelessness and told her she wanted to help her. So, and why did Mrs. Dismal hate the shepherd? Well, she blamed him for her son's problems. She couldn't see her precious son for the bully he really was. And so she blamed the shepherd. And that happens on earth too. bad thing, hard things happen, and we can tend to blame the Lord for those things. We live in a fallen world. We shouldn't blame anyone, let alone the Lord. But she did. So what did Grace and Glory do with their disappointment over that reaction of her aunt? Well, she decided to talk to the king and ask him for his wisdom and advice in what to do next, but not to quit though. And it says she was trying to batter down an impregnable stronghold with a pebble. Reminds me of David and Goliath, right? So what helped Grace and Glory get through this sadness? Well, she remembered her own journey, for one, and then she also decided to take joy and peace with her, and she saw her friends and was in an atmosphere of love and praise when she went back to her own cottage where they were preparing for the party. So what advice did Mrs. Valiant give Grace and Glory about poor Dismal? Well, she said, don't listen to her negativity, but keep on loving her. So, that's like Jesus. He just keeps on loving us. And he always spoke the truth, but he speaks the truth in love, right? So, Mrs. Valiant said she would be quick enough to object if I took her at her word. Never pay any attention to anything poor Dismal says, my dear. She is starved for love and doesn't know it. Just go on loving. It always wins in the end. Mrs. Valiant, as you may easily guess without being told, was another who had been with the shepherd to the high places and wore in her heart the flowering plant of love, which made her a citizen of that kingdom too. Then they heard the sound of footsteps outside and of happy, laughing voices, and the next moment the chief shepherd himself, surrounded by his friends, entered the cottage, and the feast began. The kettle sang on the hearth, the guests talked and laughed merrily together. The yellow cat lay purring on the chief shepherd's knees, and the black and white one curled up on the lap of Grace and Glory. The sheepdogs lay at the door wagging their tails, and Mrs. Valiant busied herself filling and refilling the cups with tea, and all in the cottage was the most mirthful and contented spot in the whole village, just as though a little bit of the kingdom of love had been transplanted down into the valley, which of course was the case. If only poor Dismal were here, sighed Mrs. Valiant just once. And then she looked across at the shepherd and saw that his eyes were looking straight at her, as though he had read and understood her thoughts. And of course he can. Then Mrs. Valiant gave a little contented smile and said to herself, it will be all right. He wants it even more than we do. It will take more than poor Dismal and her unhappy family to evade his love in the end. Then she went on bustling about, filling cups and attending to the wants of everyone, and was, without in the least realizing it, next to the chief shepherd himself, the most cheering and heartwarming person in the room. Wow, that's beautiful. Another one of the scriptures that goes with this chapter is from Isaiah 61. The Spirit of the sovereign Lord is upon me, for the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. That means poor in spirit, like Mrs. Dismal. He has sent me to comfort the brokenhearted and to proclaim that captives will be released and prisoners will be freed. He has sent me to tell those who mourn that the time of the Lord's favor has come, and with it the day of God's anger against their enemies. To all who mourn in Israel, he will give a crown of beauty for ashes, a joyous blessing instead of mourning, festive praise instead of despair. One of these times I'm going to get through reading a scripture without crying, huh? So next week is chapter 2, and we actually start with the reading about all the spices and the laws of love, yes, and the fruit of the Spirit. So Mountain of Pomegranates will be next week. Well, I'm hoping and praying that this recording is going to be able to be heard and that the audio and the video will be fine. If any of you feel on your heart to give, I would greatly appreciate that. It would help me to continue. And I love you all, and I'll see you next week, God willing. Bye-bye.